No, we do have like a couple of really fantastic poetry pairings. Anna Hall and Garrett Chamberlain will be tomorrow, and they have a wonderful interplay, a working relationship, much like these two. Michael O'Craig is the author of Indie Horse, Woods and Clouds, Interchangeable, Talkativeness, Then Komodo, Yes Master, Can You Relax in My House, and the chapbook, John Bang Jet. He's published poems in various magazines, journals, and anthologies. Poetry, The Believer, The New Yorker, and the Best American Poetry in 2014 and 2022, among them. He was Poet Laureate for the state of Montana from 2015 to 2017, and a Civitella Ranieri Foundation Fellow fall 2021. He lives in the Shields Valley where he shoots horses for a living. And then I got Christopher Brean Murray. Christopher Murray's book, Black Observatory, was chosen by Game 11 as the winner of the 2021-2022 Jake Attenborough Prize. It was recently published by Milkweed Editions. He's received awards from the Academy of American Poets and Imprint Houston. He served as online poetry editor of Gulf Coast. His poems have appeared or are forthcoming in American Poetry Review, Bennington Review, Colorado Review, and other journals. He lives in Houston, Texas. I would like to note, Michael O'Craig will be reading poetry for the 50th anniversary party for Cut Bank.
And as will Chris. We just...
Both of well, what joy! No, that's fantastic. That is not on the program. That event came together after the program went to print. We will have an insert tomorrow, available much like the insert we have for tomorrow's event with Charles Kell. But I do encourage you to come to that. You get to be a part of celebrating Western Montana literary history. Many great authors have been published. Many of them will be represented at this event, including a rare but wonderful appearance by Judy Blunt. All right. Alrighty, folks.
And when is that?
That will be at 4:45 tomorrow in this room right here. So we will have an insert available. Just come on by. It'll have all the information available to you.
So much is happening.
Yeah. Alrighty.
Hello.
Okay,
So
thank you. Take it away.
we're gonna do this Beastie Boys style and pass the mic.
Are you hearing me on the mic? Is that too loud? We're here to talk about poetry. You have to flip it to on. Yeah. Put your mouth right up to it. There we go. So this is what we're going to do today. We're going to start by each of us reading one of our own poems from our new books. Yeah. And then we're going to read, we each chose 5 poems by other writers that had a big influence on us when we were undergraduates at the University of Montana. We think it was about 1992 to 90. Well, we both graduated in 94. So we're talking a 2 or 3 year period. And I guess I would say about that period, I had already been writing poems before I got to Missoula. I got here in about late 1990. Earl also came from somewhere else and had been writing. But I think, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we both felt that being in this town, being at the university, even though we were undergraduates, we were not in the MFA program, but it felt almost as if we were, and in fact, we, as undergrads, we were taking classes along with MFA students. But certainly for me, I felt like it was this thing that kick-started my confidence in my writing. It was a time of huge, revelations to me through poetry, of going, oh my God, I didn't even know that's what a poem could be, and of and of just learning how to do it. And so we chose these poems because we felt these were examples of some of the sort of particular poems that made a huge impact and felt like a leap forward in what we were doing.
Yep, and so Chris and I ended up Chris went to University of Michigan for an MFA, and I was at UMass after being here, but both of us have talked about this when we got to those programs and we're interacting with teachers and peers. What happened here in Missoula it was like a double MFA, but I mean, in many ways, both of us feel like the growth and the excitement, the time we had here was, in some ways, I mean, a lot got covered and things changed while we were in the grad programs, but as undergrads, and I don't know if they still do this, you could, if you had exhausted the workshops, you could petition the teacher and they could decide to let you into those grad workshops. So we worked with graduate students and it was amazing. So what we're going to do today is focus primarily on like 1992 and 3, it's a really tight period. So should we start?
Yes.
Oh, we're going to start by reading one of our poems.
Yes.
You want to go ahead?
So I'll read one first. Maybe I'll say something about it afterwards, relating it to what we're talking about. This poem is called The New American Painters. They stroll through town in pigment-streaked shirt sleeves. They've allowed their hair to grow long. Without exception, they wear beards. They laugh too loudly at their own quips, at the too precious works of their predecessors. Though they once conspired in private to overturn the dominant paradigm, they now declare their intentions in cafes. Often they flee these establishments without paying for their bowls of broth, their endless espressos that cause the sky to pulse with possibilities, which they hurry to depict in oils slathered over monumental canvases crammed into drafty studios across whose bare wooden floors empty wine bottles roll. Oblivious breezes flip the pages of their sketchbooks. One artist employs a makeshift easel as another flings paint with eyes closed. Some scoop dust from the floor and smear it through clots. If that fails, a canvas is cast to the ground, its author stepping on it, spitting insults, only to resurrect it and continue the feverish brushstrokes, the breathless dance toward, then away from the canvas. Is it abstract? It resembles the bald head of a screaming Incan glimpsed from above. He wades through drifts of peonies into which cobalt sky shards tumble. It's titled The Codex. I'm reviewing it for Art Forum, and the painters refuse to comment. They just gesture toward it as if its meaning is obvious. So I'll just say about that poem, I partly chose that poem because, though I don't think it's a poem about the time we're talking about and our experience here, I do think it is informed by it a little, like the drinking of the espressos that cause the sky to pulse with possibilities. That captures something about how I felt sitting in Food for Thought, coming up with the next little ditty.
All right. Okay. I will also read a poem from this new book. This is called Standing at the Window. Due to the reaction-enhancing drugs I've been taking, the lower left side of my face sags during tennis. It sags in the locker room, and it sags on the pillow. An owl, pretending to be Joanne, screeches over and over again, but with just the right pauses for emphasis. I get up and crack the window a bit. Recalcitrant chickens drawl chicken speak into the millet hour. I hear wine evaporating on the neighbor's kitchen counter. Let's face it, I'm sensitive. Okay, so poems from the new books. They both came out roughly the same month, the spring, April. So,
Well, so the first poem of among the poets that we chose has a special significance, more than in a way than the others, because basically, I believe it was in 1992 that I was walking up to the English building on campus and encountered this guy reciting this poem, and he stopped me and he said, "Can I?" We didn't know each other, and he stopped me and he said, "Can I recite a poem for you?" And it was the first one was this poem.
So, but what we're going to do now is read all five. Okay, so I'm going to read these 5 poems, and this first one is "Good Time Jesus." Chris, you're going to do the
Yes.
We've "Good Time Jesus." We think this is going to be good and not distracting. I think this will be good. By James Tate. Jesus got up one day a little later than usual. He had been dreaming so deep there was nothing left in his head. What was it? A nightmare. Dead bodies walking all around him, eyes rolled back, skin falling off. But he wasn't afraid of that. It was a beautiful day. How about some coffee? Don't mind if I do. Take a little ride on my donkey. I love that donkey. Hell, I love everybody. Okay, so we're going to kind of move through quickly, and we're going to circle back to these. The second poem is "Vacancy in the Park," Wallace Stevens. And there are so many like famous, well-known poems. This one is one that is not so much that. Anyway, "Vacancy in the Park," March. Someone has walked across the snow. Someone looking for he knows not what. It is like a boat that is pulled away from a shore at night and disappeared. It is like a guitar left on a table by a woman who has forgotten it. It is like the feeling of a man come back to see a certain house. The 4 winds blow through the rustic arbor under its mattresses of vines. Wallace Stevens. This poet was huge for me, 91, 2, 3, W.S. Merwin. This is an interesting one because he's talking about John Berryman. So Berryman. I will tell you what he told me in the years just after the war, as we then called the Second World War. Don't lose your arrogance yet, he said. You can do that when you're older. Lose it too soon, and you may merely replace it with vanity. Just one time he suggested changing the usual order of the same words in a line of verse. Why point out a thing twice? He suggested I pray to the muse, get down on my knees, and pray right there in the corner, and he said he meant it literally. It was in the days before the beard and the drink, but he was deep in tides of his own, through which he sailed chin sideways and head tilted like a tacking sloop. He was far older than the dates allowed for, much older than I was. He was in his 30s. He snapped down his nose with an accent I think he had affected in England. As for publishing, he advised me to paper my wall with rejection slips. His lips and the bones of his long fingers trembled with the vehemence of his views about poetry. He said the great presence that permitted everything and transmuted it in poetry was passion. Passion was genius, and he praised movement and invention. I had hardly begun to read. I asked, how can you ever be sure that what you write is really any good at all? And he said, you can't. You can't, you could never be sure. You die without knowing whether anything you wrote was any good. If you have to be sure, don't write. Berryman by W.S. Merwin. Okay. This poet, Greek poet, I think I read somewhere that during his lifetime, he published 90 books of poetry. I don't know how Greek would have died maybe in the 70s. One of the most famous Greek poets, but I'm not sure. There are a lot of people who don't know his work. This is Yanis Ritsos, wax images, and it was so hard to pick. There are many of his poems, from his poems, but here's one. He entered the showroom. The lighting was dim. He studied the wax images, naked, nicely colored. He liked them, stimulating, almost erotic. Exquisite bodies, as though each had been shaped by the same prototype at various ages. When he raised his eyes, he recognized his face and theirs. At that moment, he heard footsteps in the corridor. He undressed quickly, stood there motionless. They came in, circled the showroom, and stopped, finally, in front of him. "This one seems less natural," the woman said, and she pointed him out. He heard his eyelids lowering. They closed. Amazing. And the last one, Julio Cortázar, The Behavior of Mirrors on Easter Island. When you set up a mirror on the western side of Easter Island, it runs backward. When you set one up on the eastern side of the island, it runs forward. Delicate surveys may discover the point at which that mirror will run on time, but finding the point at which that mirror works correctly is no guarantee that that point will serve for any other, since mirrors are subject to the defects of the individual substances of which they are made and react the way they really and truly want to. So that Solomon Lemos, an anthropologist on fellowship from the Guggenheim Foundation, looking into the mirror to shave, saw himself dead of typhus. This was on the eastern side of the island. And at the same time, a tiny mirror, which he'd forgotten on the western side of Easter Island, it had been dropped there between stones, reflected for no one Solomon Lemos in short pants on his way to school. Then Solomon Lemos naked in a bathtub, being enthusiastically soaped by his mummy and daddy. Then Solomon Lemos going da, da, da to the thrilled delight of his aunt Remeditos on a cattle ranch in Trenquelancan County. Okay, those are my 5. And it wasn't easy to pick. I think we each could have picked 10 or 12 poets and poems, but those are mine. Chris, do you want me to do this?
And we talked about it for a couple weeks of, no, I yanked this one and I added this one. And
yes.
But it was a lot of fun. No, I'm going to read these. Is that what you're asking?
No, do you want me to do that, or are you going to go right off that?
Oh, you can do that. That's great. Thank you. So this one is also by James Tate, who did the Good Time Jesus poem called 5 Years. Now you just changed it to I Have a Horse. Thank you. 5 years old. Stars fell all night. The Iceman had been very generous that day with his chips and slivers. And I buried my pouch of jewels inside a stone casket under the porch, their beauty saved for another world. And then my sister came home, and I threw a dart through her cheek and cried all night. So much did I worship her. Maybe scroll up a little bit. Thank you. So this one, and I guess I'll interject to just say, for both of us, something like a couple or few poems written by American poets, and I know for me, 3 of them written not in English. So some of these are translations. This one is from Tomaž Salamun from Slovenia. I have a horse. I have a horse. My horse has 4 legs. I have a record player. On my record player I sleep. I have a brother. My brother is a sculptor. I have a coat. I have a coat to keep me warm. I have a plant. I have a plant to have green in my room. I have Marushka. I have Marushka because I love her. I have matches. With matches, I light cigarettes. I have a body. With a body, I do the most beautiful things that I do. I have destruction. Destruction causes me many troubles. I have night. Night comes to me through the window of my room. I have fun racing cars. I race cars because car racing is fun. I have money. With money, I buy bread. I have 6 really good poems. I hope I will write more of them. I am 27 years old. All these years have passed like lightning. I am relatively courageous. With this courage, I fight human stupidity. I have a birthday March 7th. I hope March 7th will be a nice day. I have a friend whose daughter's name is Breditza. In the evening when they put her to bed, she says, Shalamun, and falls asleep. And this is by a German poet from the early 20th century named Georg Trakl, Landscape. September evening, the calls of the shepherds make a mournful sound through the twilit village. Fire sputters in the foundry. A black horse rears violently. The servant girl's hyacinth locks long for the fervor of its purple nostrils. At the edge of the forest, a doe moans quietly, and the golden flowers of autumn lean silently over the blue face of a pond. A tree is consumed by red flames. Bats flutter up with dim faces. This will take a little scrolling. This is a little longer one, but this is by Pablo Neruda. It's called Walking Around. I happen to be tired of being a man. I happen to enter tailor shops and movie houses, withered, impenetrable, like a felt swan navigating in a water of sources and ashes. The smell of barber shops makes me wail. I want only a respite of stones or wool. I want only not to see establishments or gardens or merchandise or eyeglasses or elevators. I happen to be tired of my feet and my nails and my hair and my shadow. I happen to be tired of being a man. Nevertheless, it would be delightful to startle a notary with a cut lily or kill a nun with a blow to the ear. It would be lovely to go through the streets with a sexy knife and shouting until I froze to death. I don't want to go on being a root in the dark, vacillating, stretched out, shivering with sleep, downward in the soaked guts of the earth, absorbing and thinking, eating each day. I do not want for myself so many misfortunes. I do not want to continue as root and tomb, just underground, a vault with corpses, stiff with cold, dying of distress. That is why Monday day burns like petroleum when it sees me coming with my jailbird face. And as it passes, it howls like a wounded wheel, and it takes hot-blooded steps toward the night. And it pushes me into certain corners, into certain moist houses, into hospitals where the bones stick out the windows, into certain shoe stores with the smell of vinegar, into streets as frightening as chasms. A little more. There are brimstone-colored birds and horrible intestines hanging from the doors of the houses that I hate. There are dentures left forgotten in a coffee pot. There are mirrors that ought to have wept from shame and fright. There are umbrellas everywhere and poisons and navels. I walk around with calm, with eyes, with shoes, with fury, with forgetfulness. I pass. I cross by offices and orthopedic shoe stores and courtyards where clothes are hanging from a wire. Underdrawers, towels, and shirts that weep, slow, dirty tears.
Both of us carried pretty beat-up copies of Residence on Earth during those years. I mean, it was always like I wore mine on a chain around my neck.
And this is the last of the poems by these other writers. This is Paradoxes and Oxymorons by John Ashbery. This poem is concerned with language on a very plain level. Look at it talking to you. You look out a window or pretend to fidget. You have it, but you don't have it. You miss it. It misses you. You miss each other. The poem is sad because it wants to be yours and cannot. What's a plain level? It is that and other things, bringing a system of them into play. Play? Well, actually, yes, but I consider play to be a deeper outside thing, a dreamed role pattern, as in the division of grace these long August days without proof, open-ended, and before you know, it gets lost in the steam and chatter of typewriters. It has been played once more. I think you exist only to tease me into doing it on your level, and then you aren't there or have adopted a different attitude, and the poem has set me softly down beside you. The poem is you. So,
All right.
scroll back to Good
Yeah,
Time
no.
Jesus.
What kind of,
I'll scroll for you.
what kind of, all right, so now we're going to just go back and touch on each poem, some more than others. Let's see here. So as Chris said, Good Time Jesus, for me, I was at a spot taking the workshops where I was getting a little bit bored with poetry. And when you're taking a workshop, you have an anthology or a couple anthologies, and I felt like I was maybe not going to continue. I don't know. Then I got to this flipping through, I came upon this poem. And so I did memorize it, and I was walking around town reciting it to people. I'd stop someone on the Higgins Street Bridge. It was interesting because you'd say, "Do you mind if I read a poem to you?" And sometimes there'd be two people, and one would be like, "Get away from me," and the other person would say, "Okay." But but what is it about this poem? So I just have a few notes in here, and these are in terms of what would be some of the lessons that I would learn, or some of the things that shocked me. In this case, one thing that I loved was the speed of the poem and the casual language. It's not the language of poetry that some of the poets were employing in the anthologies. And when I say plain, just the speed, it's right off the bat. Oh, by the way, and the title, Good Time Jesus. I mean, that word doesn't appear anywhere in the poem, good time, but it like completely bumps it up another notch. It's a hilarious word to be sitting next to the word Jesus. Jesus got up one day a little later than usual. So the speed is that each sentence, and I'm not going to call them lines, they're really I look at these like sentences. The poem just hurtles forward. How about some coffee is maybe the height of that casualness where you start asking who's doing the talking, who's speaking. And I also love this, how about some coffee? Don't mind if I do. Like, is the speaker talking to himself or talking to somebody else? There's this little back and forth, take a little ride on my donkey. I love that donkey. Hell, I love everybody. So it was the quality of the anti-poem that I just loved. And it made me, like a lot of great art later that I would discover, art that challenges me, where you sit there and think, is this good? Is this a poem? Why am I reading this? Why is it in the anthology? And why is it so fascinating? So the next poem, Vacancy in the Park. Oh, no, Chris, you go.
I guess I'm going to say something much simpler, which was just, wait, go back.
Why don't you look at that?
Okay.
So I can cut yours.
is just that poetry could be funny. I mean, that was a big revelation, at the time.
Right.
James Tate has a reputation for being extremely funny and for being, a surrealist. But and I think the poem I chose of James Tate's is maybe an example of being less obviously sort of wacky or goofy as is his earned reputation. I mean, he had one book called The Oblivion Ha Ha, but he also had another book just called Distance from Loved Ones. That's not terribly funny. So I fell in love with James Tate's humor. Playfulness is a big part of it. I'm not saying this one I chose is not playful. It's by the same author, James Tate. But I also, one thing I'll say about this poem, 5 years old, is that I don't know when I read it if I knew intellectually what it was about exactly. I think part of what really struck me about the poem initially was that image of the dart through the cheek. It was so surprising. It was so strange. And then also what's kind of said thereafter. And it more resonated than being, intellectually I really am thinking about this. It affected me on a very visceral level. But the more I thought about it over time, I guess I came to see it as a poem about a child, a 5-year-old child, but told to the degree that it's possible through the eyes of the 5-year-old child rather than through a sort of expository adult talking about a 5-year-old and explaining it. And instead, I guess I read it that maybe there was a snowstorm and the Iceman had been very generous with his chips and slivers, or the pouch of jewels, and I buried a pouch of jewels inside a stone casket under the porch, a child's fantasy of burying a stolen treasure. He's living in a bit of a fantasy world. And then the fantasy or impulses continues so that maybe it makes him throw a dart at his sister's cheek because he's not old enough to even know what that means or why he might feel an impulse to do that. Immediately regrets it, and like a child cries all night, realizing, he doesn't just feel a little sorry about it, but that he worships the sister. So it can look like a surrealist poem, in the sort of way that people sometimes use surrealist to dismiss something. Oh, it's just merely a surrealist exercise or something. But I think he uses some of the techniques he got from surrealism to tell a poem that in some ways, as it looks on the page, is as American or like contemporary an experience as you might have gotten in a William Carlos Williams poem or something like that. There's no extra word in the poem. It's all serving one end. That's how I see it.
Vacancy in the Park. This poem is a poem I also memorized around that same time. I wasn't hazing people on the street necessarily, but so this is a poem I think about every single year. Where I live in the Shields Valley, I no doubt will be seeing footprints in the snow. The opening of this, so some of the main things, he has an image in the opening couplet, but he doesn't write the image. The image is footprints in snow, but he doesn't. It's so wonderfully underwritten. Someone has walked across the snow. Someone looking for he knows not what. He doesn't say, "I'm looking at this footprints in the snow, and therefore," and then he goes on. He just talks about the fact that someone has walked in the snow. We see footprints in the snow. Then the poem moves into these boom, 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 3 similes. The first 2, very concrete. It's a boat, it's a guitar. The third one, the subject is a feeling. And this is the part that I am blown away by. This to me is insane, because look at, it's so underwritten. This is the lesson I get from this, is the underwrittenness of this poem. He doesn't have very many adjectives in here either. It's just a guitar, it's a boat, It's a man. Is the man driving a car? Is he on a bike? Is he on the sidewalk? We don't know. It's like the feeling of a man come back to see a certain house. In a workshop, we would be egged on to say more, to be descriptive, to go. I'm certain.
Is it a Victorian house?
It could be.
Who's the man?
Yeah.
Is he the milkman?
Yeah. I mean, this is what. Then when I say the underwrittenness of it, this is the main lesson here, and it's just so beautiful how. And then it shifts again away from this man at the house. The four winds blow through the rustic arbor under its mattresses of vines. Kind of a domestic. The word mattresses is sort of is interesting. But so I think that I think about that couplet all the time and how much he gets done with so few words. Incredible.
So when I was choosing my poems, I also chose a Wallace Stevens poem, and actually when Earl and I first showed our list to each other, there were 3 poems where it was the same author, right? Like we each have a James Tate poem. So, we changed it up a little to have a little less overlap, but I think you had a Tomas Chalamun poem initially. This poet, I think I found a copy of his selected poems, which at the time I think was the only Tomas Chalamun book, this is 1992 probably, in print in English that I knew of. Found it at the Book Exchange, and just kind of couldn't believe what I was encountering. It was so odd. It was so, it was such a mix of strange things. It was... I can't hear you.
Yeah, remaindered hardbacks. I mean,
it was a remaindered hardback, exactly.
Yeah, that was a great thing. Beautiful
and they were funny. They were full of dazzling imagery. Chalamun had this tendency to mythologize himself. He would mention his name in poems.
Are there any examples in here?
There's one at the end, Earl. I'm glad you brought that up. And he would say things like, Tomas Chalamun is a sphere rushing through the air. They would be these grand things, but it wasn't like just ego out of control. He would be playful about it and funny, and he would mention things about his personal life. I mean, eventually started to know a little bit about him and found out there's a real Marushka. That's really his wife and stuff. But I don't know if he really slept on his record player, but. I guess part of what I loved so much about this particular poem is the form, is this like kind of absurd simplicity of I have a horse, my horse has 4 legs. I guess part of what makes the poem interesting is the way that once he establishes that, these little ways he'll interrupt the pattern, or if some of the statements are absurdly simple, like I have fun racing cars, I race cars because car racing is fun. I mean, it sounds like a child is writing, but then he'll say things like, I am 27 years old, all these years have passed like lightning. Obviously, we're dealing with an adult here, and I am relatively courageous. With this courage, I fight human stupidity. He was a political poet on top of being a wildly imaginative poet, and those things don't always go together. And I guess I could say more, but I would just say the ending. I have a friend whose daughter's name is Breditza. In the evening when they put her to bed, she says Chalamun and falls asleep. Is so charming and gentle and funny. He was just irresistible, so I had to include him on my list.
Okay. Is it Berryman? Yeah. That one? Yeah. Okay.
You didn't explain who Berryman is, just in case we need to clarify that.
So I don't have the dates exactly, but like what's interesting about this poem, one of the things to me is Berryman would have been the older poet, John Berryman, American poet. committed suicide. So he died a little bit on the early side, maybe in his late 50s, but an American poet. He would have been the mentor to Merwin. And Merwin is, as he says in this poem, he had only just begun to read. But let me start with this. I will tell you what he told me. So what I've written here is the mentor chain is one of the things I think about with this. Because when I read this, I was 21. At that point, Merwin would have been in his mid to late 60s. When he wrote it, he was younger. But so I'm reading about a teacher who's writing about another teacher. So there's that chain. I think Chris and I are talking a lot about student days and so this is a poem that I loved because I loved Berryman, the Dream Songs, famous book of poetry, and I loved Merwin, and I'm getting a glimpse of this relationship. The rest of it is pretty self-explanatory. I love it's just like kind of a talking poem. It's not loaded with wild imagery or anything shocking, and that's part of what I loved, what I got from him. But another line that just makes me laugh, much older than he was in his 30s. It's funny just because, ancient. He was ancient. And then the other thing I want to just touch on, which I kind of did already, I had hardly begun to read. He doesn't say I'd hardly begun to write. He's talking about reading, because you cannot write without reading. And so this idea of I'd hardly begun to read, and I'm at but he's talking about knowing whether what you've written is any good. I think that's also interesting, because we all run into people who like to write, but they don't like to read. They don't want to be influenced, and there's that whole thing. And I think that I just love this poem just because it talks about what it's like to be setting out.
And I guess it also makes me think, if we're talking about, we were in our early 20s, we were undergraduates, we were trying to find our way, that, I remember finding an interview with James Tate and just gobbling it up, like going, he's, well, I also remember that he was asked at the end, do you have any advice for young writers? And I'm on the edge of my seat waiting to see what he says. And he says, yeah, don't listen to anybody.
Yeah.
But I guess I would say when I came across this poem, it was just that feeling of what is it? What is he going to say that's going to help me along?
Yeah.
And it was satisfying, but it also left you a little with that feeling of a lot of it you're just going to have to figure out.
Right.
Okay. So my next poem is Landscape by Georg Trakl. So Trakl also was a poet, for me, like Shalamoon at the time, early 1990s. You heard a little about him. There was an edition of James Wright's poetry, James Wright being a pretty well-known American poet at the time, where there were some translations that he'd done, and there were a few by Trakl in there, but you did not see a lot of books by Trakl on the shelf. But this one, translated by Daniel Simcoe, had some blurbs on the back from some writers Earl and I, admire, and I just remember being stunned encountering these strange poems written in probably the 19-teens or so, that were set in this sort of rural German landscape, melancholy, but filled with beauty, but also just threaded with death. And I think one of the blurbs described him as one of the great melancholy pessimists. And I loved that. So I think the part of this particular poem that most stuck with me was the part about a black horse rears violently. The servant girl's hyacinth locks long for the fervor of its purple nostrils. It's such a strange image. One thing he doesn't do in his poems is tell you what the hell the poem's about. He leaves it for you to figure. I mean, I read some kind of madness in there. I read some kind of erotic thing going on, but it would be very hard to pin it down exactly. But I would say that probably what's not done in the poem is probably part of its appeal, which is there's not the explanation. There is
Right.
the imagery is driving the poem.
Yeah, the Trockle, maybe more than a lot of poets, they're mood poems. So if somebody were to say, well, come on, tell me what this is about. I mean, with most poetry, I don't try. With the Berryman one, it would be easier. It's there. But the mood is set, and it's just so rich. Also, like, again, we're talking about a translation. So there was a period where Chris and I, maybe we weren't thinking about that much in the early 90s. We were reading Trockle. As time moved on, you realize when you start reading other translators translating the same material. So like this choice to have the blue face of a pond and then bats flutter up with dim faces. I mean, again, this could be something that a different translator would try hard to avoid. We don't know that this is exactly
There was
what he wrote.
another Trockle poem that I was considering putting on this list, and it had this very memorable image where it said, with no context for it, it said, "Cold metal stepped on my forehead." And I had another edition of Trockle, and I looked up the same line in this other translation, and it was something like chill steel entered upon my brow. And I was like going, I mean, one, I much prefer Daniel Simcoe's translations.
Cold metal
but it
stepped on my
does
forehead.
leave me wondering what it would be like to experience the poem in German. I don't know. I don't speak German, but I loved the
This
book that
this document.
very thing,
Yeah.
whatever you want to call it.
Yeah. Because I would always get that question, what do you think you're doing being so influenced by things in translation? And I came to the conclusion that, okay, I'm being influenced by this document, this poem, and just let's move on. Because there is an argument there. Okay, wax images. This one I don't have as much to say about. I just feel like it's all there. But the who is they? This? It's like a jury enters, and this person, the speaker, is going to be judged. I think it's Ritsos did two primary things: big, long poems, and then he wrote just hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these shorter poems. And I definitely love these short ones. But it's just kind of. He heard his eyelids lowering, they closed. The use of that semicolon is, I think that's pretty great. Also, the word natural, this idea of being less natural than wax. There's the judgment, there's like this terror that something is coming. You could say, everyone's going to have their idea on who they is, but this feeling of being judged and being a human or a man like Neruda's man who's maybe not, something is off. That's probably all I have to say there. I just love the mystery in Janos Ritsos' poems.
So, as Earl was saying, this is also a translation, and this particular translation, not just for this poem, but for the whole book, which was this fairly early. I mean, I don't mean at the very beginning of his career, but it was a fairly early. Is it a trilogy of books all combined into one volume? Residence on Earth 1, Residence on Earth 2, Residence on Earth 3. And I think he wrote a fair number of them when he was on some diplomatic post in Ceylon or something like that. But it was a period clearly of his own kind of pessimism or confronting death and decay and I don't know. It makes me sound death obsessed. That's fine. I can deal with it. But I love the commitment to what he's saying and how it's a very dark thing to write. But I love the boldness of it. I happen to be tired of being a man. I'd never heard anybody say anything like that before. And then he's going to sort of get specific. I happen to enter tailor shops and movie houses withered. And I could go on. But then the next one, the smell of barber shops makes me wail. Again, very bold statement. And so he's establishing this, and then comes this turn. Nevertheless, it would be delightful to startle a notary with a cut lily. I think part of what I think this poem is about is being exhausted with routine, with the everyday, and he wants to be startled into some kind of radical delight, which I think the whole poem is radical delight, which is why I love it, even if it's dark. Now, I realize the next line is, or kill a nun with a blow to the ear. I guess
That's wrong. We don't.
Yeah, we don't stand for that.
Chris and I don't
We
condone
refute that agenda. But I, yeah.
And he's.
I mean, I could tell you what I think, but I don't really. For the most part, I'm pretty sure he didn't do that.
Did you mention Neruda is young here, so you have kind of these camps. I know people that really have never given these residents on Earth that they kind of dislike it. They love the later, more mature love poems, odes, and then there's another camp. And I think Chris, I mean, I love all of it, but the stuff on display in Residence on Earth is. Yeah, he's edgy. He's a little bit depressed. He's wanting
He uses the word bewildered. He speaks of a bewildered man, overwhelmed. He talks about all the objects of a city swarming around him. He was going through some stuff. But I still love this poem. Yeah.
Yeah, this is amazing. This is a poem that I know we talked about a lot.
There are dentures left forgotten in a coffee pot.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, moving on.
We're going to just finish this up. Then we'll have a little time for any kind of questions, Q&A if you want to do that. When there were 4 or 5 of the Cortázar poems, but they weren't really poems. It looks like a prose poem. It basically is, and it really doesn't matter, right? What we call it. But what I learned is these were kind of like prose installments out of a book called Cropius y Famas. So I checked it out of the library based on. We didn't really talk about that anthology yet, and I got it out of the library. This would have been like 1993, and I opened the book, and the last person to check that book out of the library was 1974. Something like that. That was weird because I have this excitement. There's this information waiting for me at the library, and it's free. All I have to do is go over there and check it out. And I go and I take the book out, and it's like of so little interest to the public that it's been, a quarter of a century or something since somebody else looked at that book. But so this mainly, I love the kind of geeky braininess of it. It's very like Borges. It reminds me a lot of Borges. But this idea that delicate surveys may discover the point at which that mirror, and at first it feels like he's going to get into these delicate surveys, and it's like science talk. But the more he starts talking about these mirrors, you start to distrust him as a narrator. I mean, it's like when he says, but finding the point at which that mirror works correctly is no guarantee that point will serve for any other, since mirrors are subject to the defects. And at this point, as a reader, you're going, what? Wait. Of the individual substances of which they are made and react the way they really and truly want to. So it devolves into this kind of pseudo-official, public announcement. And then there's a period, and then the next, so that Solomon Lemos, and the poem takes off. That was just kind of thrilling, the idea that is it a poem? Is it not a poem? And then one other thing that I just love is these details. Like the first one is obvious, dead of typhus. The second one is just this mirror dropped between stones that is reflecting for no one all of this other stuff. I just love this material. I don't think I really have a whole lot else to say there. But I mean, it ends in humor. It's not funny, but it does become funny at the very end. Chris, did you have anything that you wanted to add about?
Well,
Julio Cortázar?
the image you talk about the mirror falling between the rocks, it's surrealist, you could say. I mean, this was the century of surrealism, but it's, there's some surrealism that is like, the frog riding the bicycle upstairs kind of surrealism. This is something so specific and something you can visualize that that's what I was drawn to, was the strangeness of it. I mean, it reminds me in a way of a moment in a Bergman movie or something like that.
It's a tiny mirror, and it's like it's almost an electronic device, and it's fritzing out. And I think it's all in there in that one image. And it's complicated, and it's just, I love him. Okay.
So the last of my poems is this one by John Ashbery, and I'll keep it short because we're going to try to leave some time for discussion. But I'll just say, John Ashbery, discovering his poetry in general. I mean, I don't know what you guys thought of this poem or whether you've read John Ashbery before, but I'll just say he's kind of, even he died, I don't know what, 6 or 7 years ago or 10 years ago or something, but he had a huge reputation. He'd won all the big awards and that, but people are still divided about, was he a genius or did he make no sense, or but I would say his poetry required you to totally change your expectations about what a poem was. And I guess in this poem, I chose this poem partly because this was one of the ones that allowed me to actually sort of be able to feel like I was interacting with his work, whereas some continued to be bewildering for months and years to come. But this moment in it where it gets into, I consider play to be a deeper outside thing, a dreamed role pattern, as in the division of grace, these long August days without proof. The longer he goes on, the more, it starts with, the analogy starts with as in the division, and it's like, but if you're trying to pin that down and totally understand how that's an analogy, good luck with that. But I loved it because he's experimenting, he's exploring, and yet he returns to this weird argument he's making about, he arrives at the conclusion, the poem is you. But the word play is very key, which is he is talking about poetry, and I think he is saying things that are true about poetry at the same time that he's doing it in this weird, playful, strange way.
All right.
All right.
So any questions? Anything?
So I'm just curious about these poems as they might relate to dreams or the unconscious, in the way that surrealism was a dialogue heard from someone else. So I would say some of these poems do seem to be like to me. And I'm curious whether you had ever dreamt something that ended up in a poem, or how the unconscious plays its part, or just the chance of something showing up in front of you at the time that you're writing.
Okay. Totally. I mean, I guess I would say, it's making me think of a particular kind of breakthrough moment that happened in this town, which was, I'd been writing some poems. I think when I arrived here and started taking my first workshop with Patricia Gotica, I was writing these poems that recounted certain things from my childhood, maybe describing a little landscape or taking a walk with my dogs in the woods or things like that. But when I think partly interacting with Earl and with other peers who were poets and reading the things we were reading. And then I mentioned the Bergman movie. My friend Tam is here, who ran the Crystal Theater, was seeing films that were really affecting me. But I remember a moment writing when I started to have this feeling that something was kicking in where I didn't have to plot things out. It was this feeling that a momentum had been created. And you hear different writers talk about this idea of Quentin Tarantino will say, I love it when my character's just talking to themselves and I'm just taking dictation, right? You can debate if that's what it is or whatever, but I would just say I started at some point to feel like something could take over, or if I could get to a certain place, something would come in. And then I went, well, that's what it's got to be to the degree that I can achieve that. But I always, I think from even as young as I was then, I was like, that must be the subconscious, because it would be like as soon as that would happen, I liked what I was writing. You could trust it. And that was what we were trying to do in a way, was to learn to trust this deeper thing that wasn't your scheming. Oh, if I turn it here, it'll do. It was like, I remember I wrote a poem in Patricia's class that was called Why I Write. And I was so young at the time, but I said something like, I want to flood, it was very undergraduate, but it was, I want to flood the world in poison ink. I want to write so I don't have to think. But it was that thing of, it wasn't that I wasn't thinking, but it was a different kind of thinking.
So, I do want to jump in just because I think one thing that's really interesting is a lot of the poems you selected are poems in translation, and you talked about that. And you also talked specifically about how idiom doesn't always come across when you translate languages, and it transforms them. And something that one of the reasons I selected both of your poetry books is that they include that sort of a simpler language, but also are great factories of idiom. You both do a lot of creating idiom. So do you think that is somewhat connected with this appreciation for poets who are either not primarily writing in English or having their works translated?
I guess I had not really thought of that, but I would say probably because of these poets, along with, again, just to recap or to say it again, this is a really small period of time when what we're talking about, because we went on, a lot happens when you're 21, 2, 3, 4, 5. So when you're talking about between being like 22 and 28, quite a lot of growth there. But can you explain a little bit more about what your use of the word idiom?
Yeah, the way that the language is constructed, where the meaning is because of your specific understanding of it. Like my mom's from north central Wyoming. If I came home looking particularly rough, she'd say something like, "You look like you got ate by a coyote and shit on a cactus." And your particular understanding of that phrase comes from you understand what a cactus is.
Yeah.
You understand why a coyote would eat you and shit you out on a cactus.
Yeah.
Well, it makes me think of something I read James Tate saying once about when he encountered William Carlos Williams, which he said it was such a relief when I encountered William Carlos Williams, because I realized I didn't have to write like Algernon Swinburne. It's a funny way of putting it, but I think what he meant was I can be myself to some degree. I can use everyday American language. Hell, I love everybody. Take a ride on my donkey. Don't mind if I do. I think that language certainly feeds into humor, and I think Earl and I were always drawn to poems that were at least open to humor.
Yeah,
I think.
yeah, yes, and the plain language, the colloquial, letting anything in. I was accused. It wasn't a compliment when I was at UMass. One of my teachers was, not one of my creative writing teachers, a lit teacher who I really respected, but that person was, you let anything into your poems. I mean, like that was a negative thing to that person. And he cited the opening lines of certain poems that he felt were just, unpoetic, and kind of was ribbing me about it. So, but some of the things I've looked at today, I've talked about, like, is this a poem? This one included. The plain language, colloquial language. It's funny, though. I think sometimes the poet is the last person to be able to answer a question like that, because I really haven't thought about that quite that way. But it is. I will now. I love that. I love that challenge. I see it as a wonderful challenge when writing, to take something. Why would we not want it to go that way? Take something very plain and everyday, something you hear in the bus or you read in the paper, and start a poem with that. But any other? Okay.
One appreciative observation is I'm glad you guys are doing it this way rather than a straight read of your own poetry. I know in Earl's case, seeing you reflect on these poems that you've picked, I'm going to understand your poetry a lot better after we talk about other people's poetry. And I also thank you, whoever did it, I can't remember, for choosing that one poem, that era of Neruda, because I think you're right that it's not
Maybe not.
talked about.
I was going to say maybe not what you normally think of when you think of Neruda. Yeah, if you go to a Barnes and Noble and see which ones they have on the shelf, it's going to be like the love poems and the poems of joy and celebration, the poems to read at weddings and things. It's probably not going to be that one to read at a wedding.
Yeah.
That goes over like a
nuptial substance. There's another one from that same period, walking around the ordinance of wine of nuptial substance.
Something
it's
like that.
Very, just like a horny young Neruda talking about like being in a city. It's crazy. By the way, the copies that we have, this didn't have an introduction in them, but later, maybe in 15 years ago, Jim Harrison wrote a foreword to Of Residence on Earth. You've read that, right? Which is worth looking at as its own thing. Like, I don't own that book, but every once in a while I'll be in the library or a bookstore and I'll grab that. It's pretty interesting to hear Jim Harrison talk about this particular book, of Residence on Earth. It's great.
I was also going to say, the comment you made, what it made me think of was that when you read the Surrealist manifestos written in the 20s, André Breton, the French poet who was the leader of Surrealism, part of their project involved looking back in history at all this art that they said that was Surrealism from the 1700s. That was, Hieronymus Bosch or William Blake's illustrations. Now, I'm not saying that's true, that's what that was, but the point is different artists will be looking for their precursors. Like, for Bergman, it must have been like Ibsen and probably lots of other things we don't know about, but it's not necessarily just what was in the anthology plopped in front of them in a class, And I know I guess we're getting to the time there, but I know that for us, we had certain anthologies given to us in class, and we'd be like, turn to page 324, and it would be like that one, and it wouldn't be a lot of the other stuff, but also that connects to the subconscious thing, which is that it wasn't we were deciding, it was these poems leapt out at us and said, read me.
Yep.
Whereas the other ones sat on the page.
In a way, this sounds a little like I'm, self-aggrandizing, but in a way, if you see something and immediately recognize this magic and this power in it, you don't need it to be shown, like explained to you. It's almost like you're seeing a part of yourself out in the world or in somebody else. We don't really have time to talk about this, but Ashbury for Chris and Stevens for me were difficult nuts to crack. I mean, I just remember standing in the bookstore on campus in my heavy wool coat. I guess it got rained or snowed on, and I should take some layers off. I'm cooking, and I'm in the bookstore looking at Wallace Stevens. I've been told, go check out Wallace Stevens. And I'm reading Wallace Stevens for like half an hour in the bookstore, and it's not... I'm having trouble. I mean, he just seemed like a stuffed shirt. Now when I look back at him, you can see the humor. You can see the flashes of things that I was not capable of seeing. So not everything just comes to the young person immediately, but many things do. You recognize them right away. Okay, thank you for coming out today.